everyone to the 10 Artist Talk series. Today's guest is Jane 𝙩𝙩, a poet, writer, and organizer living on the occupied, stolen, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. She is the author of the book Leaving 𝙩𝙚𝙣𝙙 Unread, and the winner of the Capilano Review's 2022 Interventions in the Archive contest. Her essays and poems can also be found in Read This When Things Fall Apart, We Are Each Other's Liberation, Black and Asian Feminist Solidarities, Queer Little Nightmares, an anthology of monstrous fiction and poetry, the Disability Visibility Project blog, The Offing, and Seventh Wave, among others. Her debut poetry collection, Echolalia, was shortlisted for the Raymond Schuster Award. She wants to live in a world where love is not a limited resource, land is not mined, hearts are not filched, and bodies are not violated. Thank you so much, Jane. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Can everyone hear me all good? Okay, awesome. Hello everyone. My name is Jane 𝙩𝙩, and my pronouns are she, her. An image description of myself. I am a East Asian person with pale tan skin, short black hair with bangs, and brown large glasses. And my background is blur. I am wearing a black shirt. My talk today is called The Repetition of Tending. I found the name of the talk series really beautiful. It also makes me think of the word intention, and the act of caring for the land. So I was thinking about how throughout our movements, tending is something that we do repeatedly, and so too renewing our intentions for creating a more liberatory future. Um, I'm going to be talking about the intersections of disability justice, poetics, and mutual aid, and how these things have become inseparable parts of my practice. So I was born in a little bit more about me. I was born in Nanjing, Jiangsu, and my family is originally from Liuhengdao and Pujiang County, Zhejiang. I have been living on the occupied territories, unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples for a little more than a decade, and before that, I lived on the occupied territories of the Musqueam, Katzie, and Tsawwassen and Kwantlen peoples in what's colonially known as Richmond, BC. So I really credit stumbling into becoming an organizer to the Idle No More movement that began in 2012. For those who don't remember or aren't aware, the I Don't Know More movement began in November 2012 in response to Stephen Harper's Bill C-45, which is maybe similar to a lot of the bills that we are also seeing now under Carney. It was to fight for Indigenous sovereignty and environmental protections. It was began by Jessica Gordon, Sylvia McAdam, Sheila McLean, and Nina Wilson. Um, and yeah, I think that just both sort of being part of the marches and the movement spaces during that period, while also being kind of deeply dissatisfied with some parts of my education in literary studies, and also just as, you know, a person who experienced life, whether that's like racism or gender-based violence, all of those things propelled me to stumble into becoming an organizer. And I think throughout that time, listening to the songs and speeches of host nations people, indigenous people on these lands, both youth and elders, attending housing marches or the Women's Memorial March really helped me understand just how deeply colonization impacted everything around me, and that also, of course, included my own life. And I think throughout that, but also before, I really gravitated towards poetry as an art form. Um, a lot of it because I felt like poetry offered me something that nothing else could, a language for self within community and world, a self as spirit interlinked with everything else. There is poetry in our marches, there is poetry in our spaces where we grieve, where we gather. Um, Poetry was what I wrote when I was a young person, when there was very little around me to support me through what I was going through. And so for me, on a very personal level, poetry became the language and material of survival. And that brings me to a quote from June Jordan that I always come back to, sort of like her raison d'etre of poetry from Poetry for the People of Revolutionary Blueprint. Poetry is a political action undertaken for the sake of information. The faith, the exorcism, and the lyrical invention that telling the truth makes possible. Poetry means taking control of the language of your life. Good poems can interdict a suicide, rescue a love affair, and build a revolution in which speaking and listening to somebody becomes the first and last purpose of every social encounter. Um, yeah, it feels like a in the context of because I was studying literature at the time, I really didn't feel satisfied with my literary education, partly because so much of the canon that was uplifted, so many of the poets from the modernist era, um, but before that as well, um, especially the modernist era, actually, they often flirted with fascism. They often had ties, very direct ties to white supremacy, and it just felt very strange to me that these poets were the ones that we return to over and over. Um, and that is a very different kind of poetics than the poetics of movements, where we, have songs, we have prayers. Those are also kinds of poems that we have, and amidst that, there is also the fact that it took years of literary activism. Um, in Canada, in so-called Canada, it was specifically during the 80s and 90s, which is something that poet and author Larissa Lige writes about in her book Slanting Eye, Imagining We, where she talks about how during this period, things like cultural appropriation and identity formations beyond and outside of the state, things that we now sort of take for granted, those are the things that were fought for within the broader mainstream literary conversation. So I think that, like, for me, I really join or feel an affinity for that movement. And it is a movement as part of all the other struggles out there, because when you read through some of these struggles, they're often tied to other kinds of social movement struggles. Um, so, um, in the last couple of years, but also before that, a lot of poets around me, a lot of authors, including myself, have been thinking about what is the role of literature. Um, Priscilla Washington, in this really beautiful interview on electric literature, on Palestinian poets on the role of literature in fighting genocide, writes, "Poetry is not life-saving surgery. No matter how much we may repeat the metaphor, poetry is not water. It cannot write the bombs out of the sky. It cannot put back together the bodies of a loved one or build a safe place for even a mouse to sleep in Gaza." But this is not to say that poetry or words in general are useless in a time of genocide. If words had no power to influence people's feelings about the bombings of hospitals or the military detention of children, then Israeli forces would not be arresting poets and other writers. And more broadly, if books did not have the capacity to shift attitudes and open up new ways of seeing the world, then there would not be so many banned books. And this just makes me like want to fight harder for our not only right to write poetry, but also to write the kind of poetry that, remakes the world as we know it. To not write the kind of poetry that would um, make people complacent, but to make them see what's going on. And this brings me to a quote from Fargo Nissim Baki, who is a Palestinian performing artist who writes on in Poetry and Mag, Notes on Craft, Writing in the Hour of Genocide. Creative work readies us for material work by offering a space to try out strategies. We think through contradictions, remind us of our own agency. We must be engaged in this kind of writing, which calls others into mobilization, generating feelings within our audiences that cannot be dispersed through the act of reading, but must be carried out into collective action. You sit, you read something, you feel grief or anger or joy, you get it all out, you put it down, you go about business as usual. This is the coercive affective system that craft insists upon. We must write in such a way that there is no business, there is no usual. Um, I think that Fargo is definitely speaking to Noor Hindi's poem, uh, uh, Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying. Um, Speaking to the ways that a lot of literary and artistic institutions are funded by the very systems that are killing marginalized people around the world, especially and including Palestinians, people in Sudan, people in Congo. Um, and I think that they are trying to think through this idea that we can witness poetry or witness art and just feel a sense of catharsis, and that is the end of our work. Like after we exit the theater, after we finish reading that poem, our work is done. And so sort of like against a sense of complacency within poetry is something that they write about. And of course, June Jordan is one of many poets who did this very well in her work, including, just calling out the reality, the economic reality of being a poet in the USA. So this poem, this is just an excerpt from it, but it's dedicated to the 600,000 Palestinian men, women, and children who lived in Lebanon from 1948 to 1983. Yes, I did know it was the money I earned as a poet that paid for the bombs and the planes and the tanks that they use to massacre your family. Um, the fact that like poetry can offer such direct language to speak to others is a really powerful attribute about it, I think. Um, and I think that like the question of writing in these times also requires us to read a lot of other poets. And for me, of course, that has been a part of my practice for a while, but especially now it feels important to read Palestinian poets, both in Palestine and the diaspora. Um, as I do mutual aid work as well. So this poem I was reminded of the other day on social media. It's um, the idea of not writing as business as usual also makes us think about how do we write about death? How do we write about grief? This one is called Tonight We Die as a Family by Muhammad Al-Kurd, whose book Perfect Victims you should definitely check out too. At the hospital, the nurse is startled. A surprise visitor, her husband's corpse on a stretcher. He arrived in the back seat of a taxi, a makeshift hearse. There are not enough ambulances in Gaza, and more than enough death. She is livid. Men never listen. I told you wait till after my shift. I need to tend to the wounded first. I told you tonight we die as a family. We were supposed to die as a family. Yeah, just like the, I don't know, it's just like there's like this use of dramatic irony, and dialogue that really, I don't know, it feels like Muhammad is like rethinking what grief and death is, um, and sh sort of shining a light on what the relationships that are being broken are by this genocide. Um, and poetry can also really rewrite the English language when we are writing in the English language. Um, for example, this poem from George Abraham called Ars Poetica, in which every pronoun is a free Palestine. And so I think there's almost like this sort of pleasure in being able to take apart language that poetry provides us. And the repetitive nature of free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine, and these different iterations um, really helps us. It's sort of like fights the propaganda of the states and the silencing and the erasure. So that, yeah, this is another example that I found really beautiful, that worth checking out later. Um, and another tool that poets have, um, not just the sonic repetition of like free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine, but also visual repetitions such as this one that both mirror other kinds of art forms like weaving or fabric, or just like the sort of symmetry within the natural world, in Layli Long Soldier's obligations too. There's so many different ways to read it. As we embrace the future, we work to understand the grief. We shift into light across our faces. As we embrace the present, we struggle to find the grief. We wield into light across our faces. As we resist the past, we begin to accept the grief we bury as ash across our faces. As we resist the past, we fail to question the grief we bury as ash across our faces. And of course, if you read it the other way, from right to left, we also, at some point, we say the grief, the grief, the grief. Yeah, so I'm going to read actually in response to Layli Long Soldier's poem, a poem that I wrote. It was published in the Ex-Puritan in Sanawani's Animalia issue. It's called Unit 100. For a bit of context, Unit 100 was one of the covert human experimentation and torture. It was one of the covert experimentation and torture facilities of the Second Sino-Japanese World War and World War II, conducted by the Japanese Imperial Army. And this particular facility was dubbed the Warhorse Disease Prevention Shop. So basically, created this like idea that this facility is to prevent diseases in war horses, but what it actually did was um, uh, test biological and chemical weapons on crops, on animals, with a focus on war horses, because back in the 1930s, people were still using horses, but also they, just like the rest of Unit 731, which is the larger apparatus across China and also Singapore, um, they also tested on humans. So this is my poem, Unit 100. Layli Long Soldier reminds us that we have obligations to the mosquito. I scratch my spider bite, chew on the fact that July 11th is World Horse Day. Funny that we have International Day of the Cats, National Llama Day, International Crow and Raven Appreciation Day. Funny that it isn't stalactite night of the bat, ocean epoch of the orca, galaxy eon of the tardigrade. Every unit of time for every living creature in every possible borderless universe. Every mushroom, every sunflower, every field. Someone faced the sun and said, "Let there be a day." And isn't it true a universe blooms every nanosecond? July 11th, the day my parents and I flew with the birds on China Eastern Airline to Richmond for the first time. When I woke up, I saw a large dog, ones as large as me, for the first time. Large dogs who watched the poet grow taller and taller and then stopped. The world knows its first like its thumb and index rubbing themselves into a spark. July 11th, another Gregorian calendar day in which imperialist doctors threw human kindling into fire. Fire that trembled at what it was made to do. May there be a night, a day, an entire lunar cycle, 2000 also, for the non-human Maruta. Horses, monkeys, goats, sheep, dogs, chicken, rats, camels, pigs, fleas, ticks. No zodiacs forgotten. Give us a consolation for how the rats have suffered too much in the name of progress, empire, nibbling away at the unburied dead who were called them. Isn't this the real lesson of Phoebe Gilman's Something from Nothing? Gillian Jiggs and the Wonderful Guinea Pigs. In Germany, their statue pays tribute to the animals that have and continue to donate their lives to save everyone else's. Who tallies these savings? A monument is but a punish of stones. Stones who would rather be thrown at a tank. Rat root works. Won't there be 7 generations for the rat root, for the Devil's Club, and 7 generations after that? The mice that nibble at the margins of the book. Do not live so that some of us may have our days. Do not die for no rhyme, no reason at all. Um, so some of the questions that I think about when it comes to poetry and the rest of my practice and just how we relate to poetry and art in general is are what tools within poetry support us in our mutual aid work, and how do we avoid the co-optation of poetry, literature, and art. Um, so just a little bit, one of the things that propelled the writing of my first book, that really made me think about this question a little bit more was um, reflecting on June Jordan, how to take control of the language of my life, to cast it into shape, and to understand my own disabled body mind as worthy of art making and poetics. This is likely why in my book I gravitated a lot towards concrete and shape poetry, sort of reflecting this idea of shape. But also time. I think that there are a few poems that are kind of like shouting out the movie and story behind Arrival, so this like cyclical nature of everything that we're doing, life and language, right? And there are like aesthetic strategies that really reflect the things that we do within both our lives, but also in social movements, using humor, using irony, using different shape shifting mechanisms depending on what we're doing. Um, and that I think is something that sort of happens within, like, organically within the work that I do outside of strictly poetry. I think, for example, like I chose these three graphics and the middle one is from the artist 𝙩𝙚𝙣𝙙. Um, Mutual aid work in this sort of like visually like we do privilege visuals, right? But like the way that we put them together is also part of how we enable disability justice work and mutual aid to happen using, like parody of songs, using rhythm. There's like a repetition to uh mutual aid callouts basically. So for those who are not aware, disability justice emerged in the mid-aughts from queer and racialized disabled organizing in the US. I would argue that disability justice is something a lot of um, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have always practiced in some ways, but maybe didn't articulate, um, especially when fighting against eugenics and racism and fascism. But specifically, this iteration of disability justice came out of also performing arts, with projects like Sins Invalid, where disabled people who are normally not ever seen, who are told through the ugly laws that ban disabled people from showing their faces in public, here we are. We are dancing. We are reciting poetry. We are here. Um, and I think that another thing about sort of the relationship between disability justice and mutual aid and why for me they really came together really naturally is also just the fact that um, Kropotkin's um, mutual, like theorizing of mutual aid really originally was a rebuttal to Darwin's survival of the fittest idea. His observations that, are not new, they're not new observations. But I think that historically, thinking about the way that Darwinism and all these other ideas solidified eugenics in our society, really normalized. It told us that, immunocompromised people should just stay home. Um, or that they're not fighting for. That, people masking still in 26 is that they are just anxious or whatever. Those are things that I think about the history of mutual aid and disability justice in tandem in that way. And that kind of also helps me kind of reflect, oh, how did I get from Masks for East Van to Crips for East and for Gaza? They're all related. Um, yeah, and so just a little bit about Christopher Eason's. Um, Most folks are aware, but I will share the origin story. We began on Christmas Day of 2023. Leah Lakshmi, Piepsana Samrosina, and Alice Wong reached out to me upon I was using the immunocompromised people are worth protecting graphic to raise funds for eSIMs. And my friend Vivian Lee at Masks for East Van, when I was still organizing with Masks for East Van, taught me how to purchase one. And, the this project really came out of a collective effort. It continues to be a collective effort. I'm thinking about grief as well with Alice's passing, but also the origin of Christopher Eason's, which is, both our collective grief of the genocide in Gaza, but also the late Stacey Park Milburn, who had really, really successful disability justice crowd funds, where people were just sending $10 $5 of what they have. Um, yeah. So another important aspect of my practice has been translation. Language justice and disability justice are very much linked. Sins Invalid actually has like a whole language justice commitment that they do really beautifully with both ASL, Spanish, and sometimes other forms of sign language. But something th this is also something that is part of Crips for ESIMS. We have our article translated into many languages, but also we got a graphic designer to translate and sort of design this beautiful poster of Rasha Abdullah's words. Wherever you are, whatever sand you can throw on the gears of genocide, do it now. If it's a handful, throw it. If it's a fingernail full, scrape it out and throw it. Get in the way however you can. The elimination of the Palestinian people is not inevitable. We can refuse with our every breath and action. We must. I think that I like to return to this statement from this call to action from Russia in the context of thinking about disability justice is because of that image of the sand in the fingernail. Um, like people who are bedbound and can't leave the house, people who have very limited capacity are often told that they are not doing enough, that they are not part of these movements, that they are not integral to it. And so this idea that even if you just have a little bit of sand to throw against the gears of genocide, do it. Um, and that's sort of what propelled Crips Reasons to continue into the third year of this genocide, which is, um, like I think that like a part of me knew that it had to be that way. Um, and that's why, so one of the principles of disability justice is sustainability. So that was something that was a huge part of the thinking of this project. But also just the idea that all skills are welcome. I wrote in this article, Ritual and Repetition, that through doing this project, I was unlearning this myth of real organizers. This is something that everybody can do. So yeah. And yeah, tending requires a diversity of tactics. It just reminds me of how poets observe animals and the natural world alongside Kropotkin's observation of the natural world. People are not all doing the same things. They're doing all kinds of things together towards the same goal. Um, yeah. And I think that like if I'm thinking about how like artists like Barra Bones and graphic designers like Sunny Chu, they are putting their art into this movement, into this mutual aid work, and and it's like a, interdisciplinary practice, but it's like it's just how these things happen. Um, and I come back to this idea of repetition as rehearsal, which is something that Jody Chan and Noah Sun talks about in their community anthology on repetition, but also as faith. Because as I learned through doing this project, we don't really know what this eSIM necessarily is going to do. Like something that people like might say is like, how do you know if this blah blah blah? But like I think that obviously over time we develop relationships with people on the ground. We see that people were able to graduate university despite everything because of them. They were able to talk to their family members, and it's sort of like you don't think about the result, you just do it. Is what I think I was getting at in this article. And then the faith that it requires to do this work is really important too, especially because of the way that colonization takes away our very diverse spiritualities and spiritual practices, but also this sense of like, we don't know if we will win. We probably won't anytime soon, but we still do it. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll end by reading maybe a few poems and then I'll leave it for questions. This one is called Love by Asada Shakur. Love is contraband in hell, 'cause love is an acid that eats away bars. But you, me, and tomorrow hold hands and make vows that struggle will multiply. The hacksaw has two blades. The shotgun has two barrels. We are pregnant with freedom. We are a conspiracy. I'll read Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton as well. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love you back. Love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you, in your innocence, sail through this or that. Thank you.